I still remember the moment like it happened yesterday, even though I've tried to block it from my mind countless times. One second, my daughter was laughing on the dock, her small hands clutching the railing, the sunlight dancing on the water like it belonged to her. The next, a shove, sudden, cruel, unprovoked, and she was screaming, thrashing, plunging into the icy lake. Time slowed as my stomach dropped, every nerve screaming that something unspeakable had just happened. My heart felt like it had been ripped from my chest. I ran forward, shouting her name, my voice cracking with fear and rage, but the in-laws just stood there, smirking, as if this were a joke I wasn't in on. I dove in after her, the cold shock of the water stealing my breath, panic clawing at me as I fumbled to reach her. Her tiny hands slapped the water, eyes wide with terror, and I thought, God, don't let this be how it ends. When I finally grabbed her, pulling her against me, shivering and coughing, relief hit for only a moment before anger and disbelief surged. How could people do this to a child? To my daughter, I held her tight, feeling the tremor in her body echo my own, and in that instant, I knew nothing in that family would ever be the same. Fear mixed with a rising fury, and I promised myself they would pay, though I had no idea just how yet. The lake had turned from a place of laughter to a stage for cruelty in an instant. I had witnessed their true colors, and even as I wrapped a trembling arm around my daughter, I knew that the calm, polite facades of that family had just shattered forever. This was no accident, no misunderstanding. The message was clear, and it burned hotter than any fear. Their cruelty would not go unanswered. I hadn't been far from the dock when it happened, sitting on a bench pretending to scroll through my phone while keeping an eye on my daughter. I remember feeling a flicker of unease earlier, the way her in-laws had exchanged those sly, calculating glances. At the time, I brushed it off, thinking perhaps I was being overly protective. But in that split second when they shoved her, every instinct I had screamed that I had ignored a warning I should have listened to. I froze for a heartbeat, heart hammering, watching her hit the water, then snapped into motion. I wasn't the only one who had noticed. My brother had been a quiet presence that day, standing a little apart from the chaos, his expression unreadable. People often underestimated him. Too polite, too calm, the kind of man who could be dismissed as harmless. But I had learned long ago that he noticed everything. That quiet intensity he carried wasn't just temperament. It was a storm waiting to be unleashed. Even now, I could feel his gaze on the water, calculating, silent, and terrifying in its precision. I dove toward my daughter as he moved with the same quiet efficiency he always had, positioning himself where he could intervene if needed. In that moment, my panic met his calm, and for a fraction of a second, I felt a thread of hope that maybe we weren't powerless. The in-laws had expected chaos, screams, and helplessness, but they didn't count on someone like him noticing, anticipating, waiting. That subtle presence, barely acknowledged by anyone else, had suddenly become a lifeline. As I pulled my daughter close, coughing, water dripping from her hair, I could feel his eyes scanning the family, measuring them, silently noting every smirk, every cruel expression. There was a tension in the air now, one they couldn't see yet, but I could feel it tightening. It was the calm before the storm, the unspoken promise that someone who had been overlooked was ready to act. My pulse raced, both from the adrenaline of saving her and from the dawning realization that this incident had shifted the balance of power entirely, even if no one else knew it yet. That day, witnessing the shove, I realized that the danger was only the beginning, and that my brother, quiet and underestimated, was going to be a key piece in a reckoning they would never see coming. Every move, every detail, and every glance from now on carried weight. I could only cling to my daughter, shivering and scared, knowing that the real story had only just begun. By the time we reached the shore, my daughter was coughing violently, shivering, and her little body trembled as though the cold water had seeped into her bones. I wrapped her in my coat, rocking her against my chest, whispering over and over that she was safe, that I had her, that nothing like this would ever happen again. But my relief was short-lived. Even as her lips turned pink and her shivers slowed, the in-laws had already begun their gaslighting. "She's so clumsy," one of them muttered, brushing it off like it had been her own fault. "Maybe if she paid more attention?" Another smirked, glancing at me with faux sympathy, as though my anger and fear were the problem. I wanted to scream, to shake them, to make them feel even a fraction of the terror they had caused. But I couldn't. I had to keep my daughter calm, had to hold her together while my blood boiled. At the hospital, nurses fussed over her, checking vitals and wrapping her in warm blankets, their concern a stark contrast to the cold indifference of her family. Watching them hover, soothing her, I felt a swelling mix of relief and rage. Relief that she was okay, and rage that these were the same people who had pushed her into the lake and were now pretending innocence. Every glance from the in-laws was a silent accusation, and I could see my daughter trying to make sense of it, her little brows furrowed, eyes wide with confusion and fear. I held her hand as the doctor explained that she was physically fine, no broken bones, no lasting harm. But the emotional scars were already forming, and the in-laws' dismissive comments only deepened them. Watching her shiver, her trust shaken, my heart ached. How could they see this as an accident when the terror in her eyes said everything? I wanted the world to see what they had done, to understand that this was deliberate cruelty masquerading as casual neglect. That night, as she slept fitfully, I sat beside her, letting my mind replay the events in agonizing detail. The injustice of it all twisted inside me, feeding a quiet fury I hadn't allowed myself to feel fully until now. I promised her silently that I would never let this go unpunished. That promise, unspoken but unwavering, was the seed of what would come next, a reckoning they would never forget. The next morning, the tension hadn't eased, it had only thickened. My daughter, still shaky from the lake, clung to me as we entered the family gathering, expecting perhaps a shred of apology or concern. Instead, we were met with smirks, whispers, and that unmistakable look of superiority on her in-laws' faces. They acted as if the previous day had been a minor inconvenience, nothing more than a funny anecdote they could chuckle over with each other. Their laughter felt like ice against my skin, sharp and deliberate, aimed to belittle and dismiss. "She always finds trouble," one of them said, loud enough for everyone to hear, a casual dig that landed like a punch in the stomach. "Maybe you should keep a better eye on her." My daughter's small hands gripped mine, trembling, and I could see the confusion and hurt written all over her face. She didn't understand why people she thought were family could be so cruel, why the people who were supposed to protect her instead ridiculed her. My heart broke in pieces for her, and a slow, simmering rage began to build inside me. Their comments were calculated, small jabs designed to assert dominance, to remind us that we were outsiders in their world. They flaunted their wealth, their connections, their social status with every word, every glance. I felt the sting of their superiority acutely, how they believed that privilege made them untouchable, that their cruelty could never be answered. Every laugh, every smirk, was a reminder that this wasn't just about a shove into a lake, it was about control, power, and social hierarchy. I knelt down next to my daughter, whispering reassurances I didn't fully feel yet. My mind raced, thinking about how easily they assumed their authority over us, how blind they were to the consequences of underestimating me. I had always known my daughter-in-law's family was difficult, but this blatant mockery, this calculated gaslighting, exposed the full extent of their cruelty. It was a deliberate, almost theatrical act of dominance, and it lit a fire inside me I couldn't ignore. As I sat there, feeling their judgment and ridicule press against us, the first threads of a plan began to form. I would not let them get away with this. The scales had been tipped too far, and the humiliation they inflicted demanded a response. They may have thought they were untouchable, that their wealth and status made them invincible, but they hadn't counted on me, or on the quiet strength my family carried beneath the surface. The reckoning was coming, and they would not see it until it landed squarely in front of them. I sat in the corner of my kitchen long after everyone had left, the house finally quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock and the memories that kept replaying like a cruel film. My hands trembled not from fear now, but from the pressure of everything I'd witnessed. The shove, the laughter, their smug faces. I could feel the anger under my skin, but what surprised me was how clear my mind had become. Instead of lashing out, I started cataloging every slight, every insult, every moment that had been dismissed as trivial until it accumulated into something dangerous. I thought about the wedding they'd dismissed us from, The inheritance comments muttered at holidays. The times my daughter was left out of family photos or called clumsy in front of guests. Each cruelty had felt small when it happened, like pebbles tossed at a window, but together they formed a pattern. I filed each pebble by date and face, the way a detective collects clues. It wasn't righteous fury that guided me so much as a precise, patient anger, the kind that plans, that waits, that learns. My brother had always been the quiet one, the observer. Watching him over the years, I realized he didn't waste energy on scenes. He read them. The tilt of his head when someone lied, the way he remembered small betrayals others shrugged off. Those were not quirks, but tools. People dismissed him as harmless, which had always been his advantage. If I was to act, I would not act alone. His patience paired with my determination could become something the in-laws hadn't expected. Strategy. I started thinking in terms of leverage. Not the flashy kind you imagine in movies, but leverage built from tiny, undeniable truths. I could document their offhand remarks, save receipts, keep copies of messages where their contempt leaked through politely phrased sentences. The idea of gathering proof calmed me. It turned raw panic into a series of steps. I pictured ordinary scenes, a brunch, a charity dinner, where a single, well-timed revelation could rearrange loyalties and expose pretensions. At night, I wrote lists, names, habits, weaknesses. I circled prideful siblings and penciled in potential witnesses who might be more sympathetic than they appeared. I noted business ties and vanity projects, the small things they obsessed over that masked deeper insecurities. My hypothesis was simple. People who weaponize status fear exposure more than they fear losing money. So my plan was never financial ruin first. It was humiliation in the places that mattered to them. Still, there were moral boundaries I wouldn't cross. This was not a quest for revenge that mirrored their cruelty. It was about restoring dignity for my daughter and setting a clear line. I rehearsed conversations in my head, practiced remaining composed so my words would land like a scalpel rather than a shout. Planning became my armor. Each detail I recorded felt like a reinforcement against the chaos they had tried to create. I found myself checking in with my brother more often, trading ideas over coffee and silence. He suggested patience, focusing on creating a narrative others would believe rather than staging a spectacle. His calm was unnerving because it implied method. Together we started small, quietly asking guests what they'd seen, making notes of inconsistencies, saving messages and photos that contradicted the polished stories the in-laws told. Every small confirmation was a small victory. By the time I finally lay down that night, exhaustion tugged at me. But it was a new sort of tired, one forged from purpose. The map in my mind no longer felt like a list of grievances, but a strategy forming. I didn't yet know the final move, but for the first time since the lake, control returned. Control promised interruption of their smug certainty, and that promise, more than anger, felt like justice beginning to take shape. I pictured the moment when they would realize the world had seen them for who they were, quietly, irreversibly, and how their masks would crumble. That image warmed me oddly. It wasn't cruelty, it was correction. With that, I closed my notebook and waited for the right opening. The following weekend, tension hung thick in the air, and my daughter-in-law's family was already primed to make another show of their superiority. They had invited us over under the guise of reconciliation, but I knew better. My daughter clung to me, shrinking under the weight of their stares and whispered comments. And I felt a familiar surge of anger rising, tempered only by the knowledge that patience would be more powerful than confrontation. That's when he appeared, my brother. Calm, deliberate, entirely unnoticed by anyone but me. No one expected him to be there. He hadn't been mentioned, no hint that he would show up. Yet there he was, standing in the doorway, watching the interactions with a quiet intensity that made my stomach twist. The family laughed and whispered as if the last incident had never happened, and I felt my daughter stiffen, bracing for another humiliation. But my brother's presence shifted something subtly yet irrevocably. His gaze, measured and deliberate, lingered on the smug expressions, and for a split second, they sensed they were being scrutinized, though they had no idea by whom. As the conversation continued, one of the in-laws tried to belittle my daughter with a sly remark about her clumsiness, expecting another round of embarrassed silence. Before I could react, my brother stepped forward, casually correcting their story with a single, precise detail that contradicted their narrative. The room fell silent, the laughter fading as people realized something had slipped past them. An unseen observer had been keeping track all along. My daughter looked at him, eyes wide, relief washing over her like a cool breeze. I felt it too, a quiet shock, that delicious sense of satisfaction that comes from watching someone's carefully constructed confidence falter, even just slightly. No words needed to be harsh or loud. The shift had already happened. The in-laws, used to controlling the room with arrogance, sensed that their dominance had been challenged. My brother's subtle intervention had undone their performance without anyone else realizing how. For the first time since the lake, I saw my daughter exhale, a small but significant release of tension, knowing she was not entirely alone in this. It was a tiny victory, but it mattered. Their confidence had cracks now, and my brother had exposed one without the family even understanding how. The dynamic had shifted, quietly but irrevocably, and the knowledge that someone capable and underestimated was watching them sent a wave of shock through me. In that subtle, unexpected moment, the first threads of their unraveling began, and I realized that patience, observation, and timing could be far more devastating than anger unleashed too soon. In the days that followed, the in-laws carried themselves with the smug confidence of people who believed the world owed them deference. Every glance, every carefully measured word, was a reminder that they thought themselves untouchable. They laughed at small inconveniences, flaunted wealth and connections as though it made them invincible, and treated my daughter like a fragile, expendable prop in their social theater. I watched it all quietly, recording the patterns, the lies, the arrogance that underpinned every interaction. I began keeping a meticulous mental catalog, offhand insults, veiled threats, every slight against my daughter or me. What others might dismiss as trivial, I saw as pieces of a larger puzzle. I revisited old family gatherings in my mind, noting who had quietly supported us, who had stayed silent, and who might be swayed if presented with evidence. Allies were hidden among familiar faces, people who had their own reasons to resent the in-laws, or had glimpsed the cracks in their perfect facade. Every interaction was a potential thread to tug at, every casual remark a leverage point. Evidence became my obsession, not for public spectacle yet, but as ammunition for the moment when the scales could be tipped. Emails, text messages, and photographs that subtly contradicted their story were saved, cataloged, and mentally filed. I began making notes about their habits, social events, the places they valued most, and the small vulnerabilities they refused to admit. The more I observed, the more I realized just how fragile their sense of superiority was, even though they projected it like armor. Suspense began to coil tighter with each encounter. The in-laws continued to act untouchable, unaware that someone was quietly tracking their every move, calculating, preparing. The anticipation of the moment when control could be shifted became almost intoxicating. I found myself analyzing conversations, predicting reactions, imagining the subtle disruptions that would send ripples through their polished world. The tension was no longer only about what they could do to us. It was about what we could now do to them, methodically and decisively. At night, I reviewed my mental notes, imagining the precise timing of revelations, the careful exposure of contradictions that would make their arrogance crack. My daughter, still cautious and fearful, began to watch me with a flicker of hope, sensing that someone who had seemed invisible was orchestrating a plan to protect and avenge her. Each step I took was measured, designed to create suspense, to ensure that when the moment came, the in-laws would be blindsided, unable to anticipate the shift in power they had arrogantly assumed would never occur. By the end of those days, a plan had begun to take shape, not a reckless retaliation, but a careful strategic dismantling of their inflated sense of superiority. Every small observation, every hidden ally, every piece of evidence was a building block, a way to escalate tension until the right moment arrived. And with each passing interaction, the anticipation grew, thickening like a storm just beyond the horizon, promising that the reckoning would be inevitable and unforgettable. The following weekend, the family arranged another gathering, this time under the guise of a casual brunch, but the air was charged with the same smug superiority that had marked every encounter since the lake incident. I watched from across the room, my daughter clinging to my side, her unease palpable. Every laugh, every self-satisfied glance from the in-laws felt like a challenge, a dare for me to act. I didn't move yet. I let them perform, let them bask in the illusion that nothing could touch them. But inside, a quiet storm was brewing. Every detail I had observed over the past weeks, every slight, every contradiction, every hidden ally, was aligning like pieces of a puzzle. I let small, seemingly casual comments slip in conversations, planting seeds of doubt and curiosity without raising suspicion. The in-laws, confident in their control, didn't notice the subtle undercurrent shifting the room. They had no idea that their perfect little world was on the brink of unraveling, and that realization was almost exhilarating. My daughter's eyes flicked up at me, sensing something I could barely conceal. "Are they going to pay for what they did?" she whispered, clutching my hand. I smiled faintly, squeezing hers. Not yet. Timing mattered. A premature reveal could ruin everything. I allowed the tension to build, the anticipation to thrum through the room, each moment tightening like a drawn bowstring. Every interaction that morning was a rehearsal for what was to come, a chance to gauge reactions and plant subtle clues that could later be pulled together for maximum effect. I caught the in-laws' smug expressions, the slight hesitations in their laughter, and the tiny betrayals in their words. Each one confirmed what I had suspected. They believed themselves untouchable, blind to the fact that the narrative was already shifting beneath their feet. By the end of the brunch, I let a single, calculated comment slip, hinting that I knew more than I should, that patience had been my ally, and that their arrogance would not go unchallenged. Their faces flickered with unease for a fraction of a second, though they tried to mask it. I didn't push further. The moment would come, and it would be devastating. As we left the gathering, I could feel the tension lingering in the air, an invisible thread connecting the past wrongs with the reckoning yet to come. The in-laws thought the game continued on their terms, but I knew differently. A storm was coming, subtle yet inevitable, and when it struck, it would leave no doubt about who had been underestimated all along. The first flickers of fear were beginning to show in their eyes, though they didn't yet realize the full scope of what was coming. A week later, the first ripple of retribution arrived, subtle but devastating. The in-laws had been hosting a charity auction, a meticulously polished event where every detail was meant to showcase their wealth and influence. I had learned through quiet observation that they prized recognition more than almost anything else, and I realized that striking there could deliver a lesson without a direct confrontation. I spent days gathering evidence, quietly connecting with people who knew the truth behind their polished stories, allies who had their own reasons to see the family's arrogance exposed. The evening began as expected, the in-laws in their usual state of self-satisfied confidence, greeting attendees with practiced smiles, every movement calculated to project control. My daughter, still wary but growing braver, clutched my hand as we mingled at the edge of the room. I could see their eyes scanning for flaws in others. Little smirks exchanged between them as they subtly reminded everyone of their social superiority. But this time, they didn't notice the small, carefully planted pieces I had arranged. The foundation of their flawless image was already cracking. At the height of the event, I allowed a few pointed questions to surface from allies I had quietly briefed in advance, highlighting inconsistencies in the family's charitable claims, their exaggerations, and minor financial missteps that were verifiable. The in-laws' smiles faltered for the first time, the room's attention shifting subtly, whispers rising like a tide. They tried to recover, to laugh it off, but the credibility they had relied on was slipping through their fingers. I watched, quietly savoring the moment, as their carefully curated image became suddenly vulnerable. My daughter's eyes widened, a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. She could feel the shift in power, the subtle validation of all the injustices she had suffered at their hands. For the first time since the lake incident, she wasn't merely a victim. She was a witness to her family finally experiencing the consequences of their arrogance. I felt a rush of controlled satisfaction. This was not cruel revenge. but a lesson delivered in the currency they valued most: public perception. By the end of the evening, the damage was done. Guests whispered, exchanged glances, and the in-laws' faces betrayed the slightest cracks of panic and embarrassment. Their financial reputation had taken a hit, small but undeniable, and the social leverage they relied on was weakened. I knew they would now be more cautious, more uncertain, and that uncertainty was the first taste of karma they could not escape. As we left, my daughter squeezed my hand and whispered, "They can't do that to me anymore, can they?" I smiled, holding her close, knowing this was only the beginning. The game had shifted. The balance of power had begun to tip, and the reckoning I had envisioned was now closer than ever. As I tucked my daughter into bed that night, I found myself drifting into memories I had long tried to bury. The lake incident had cracked open old wounds, revealing patterns I had recognized all my life but seldom confronted. I remembered birthdays where I had been ignored, efforts unnoticed, sacrifices taken for granted. Small betrayals accumulated into a lifetime of quiet hurt. A parent's dismissive glance, a cousin's cruel joke, a sibling's backhanded compliment. Each moment had been a test of patience and restraint, and I had survived them all, often silently, often alone. One memory stood out vividly: my 16th birthday, celebrated in the same house where family pride overshadowed warmth. I had spent weeks saving money to buy a thoughtful gift for a relative, only for them to scoff, claiming it wasn't enough. The sting of inadequacy, imposed not by real deficiency, but by their expectations and judgment, had been a lesson I carried forward, an early introduction to injustice and the powerlessness of being overlooked. Yet even then, a part of me had quietly vowed to remember, to learn, and to act when circumstances allowed. I thought of my first job, the promotions I had earned through relentless effort, and the way my achievements were minimized or dismissed by family members who preferred to highlight flaws rather than successes. Each slight reinforced a resilience I hadn't realized I was cultivating, a calm, patient strength that waited for the right moment to be wielded. It wasn't defiance, it was strategy, honed through years of observing, enduring, and quietly calculating. The betrayals were not always dramatic. Often, they were subtler, emotional omissions that left me questioning my worth, family gatherings I wasn't invited to, compliments I never received, moments where my opinions were ignored in favor of louder, more assertive voices. Those experiences had shaped the lens through which I viewed the lake incident. I recognized the in-laws' cruelty not as an isolated event, but as the latest chapter in a lifelong story of underestimation, neglect, and emotional manipulation. And yet, beneath every slight, there was a thread of resilience. I had learned to protect myself emotionally, to remain composed even when hurt, and to observe with clarity instead of reacting impulsively. That patience, cultivated through years of subtle betrayals, was now my greatest weapon. It allowed me to see patterns others missed, anticipate reactions, and prepare responses with precision. My daughter, innocent and vulnerable, became the catalyst for this patience to transform into action, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not dictate the future. By the time I turned off the lights and sat alone in the dark, I realized that every act of neglect, every subtle betrayal had been training for this moment. My resilience was no longer passive. It was poised, strategic, and ready. And as I pictured the in-laws' impending reckoning, I understood that their underestimation of me was not their strength. It was my advantage, a seed planted long ago, now ready to bloom into something they could neither predict nor escape. The day of the family gala arrived, a grand affair meant to showcase wealth, influence, and perfect appearances. The in-laws had spared no expense: crystal chandeliers, expensive hors d'oeuvres, and a meticulously curated guest list designed to reinforce their social dominance. My daughter clutched my hand, quiet but alert, sensing that something in the air was different. I had rehearsed this moment for weeks. Each detail, each ally, each piece of evidence meticulously aligned. My brother and I had planned the timing, the placement, the subtle nudges that would unravel the facade they relied on so heavily. As the event began, the in-laws moved with their usual confidence, greeting guests with polished smiles and carefully measured gestures. They didn't notice the quiet murmurs of key attendees we had prepared. nor the small slips of information circulating that contradicted the family's carefully constructed image. My brother's presence was almost invisible, yet it was lethal in its subtlety. He moved among the guests with precision, guiding conversations, dropping small revelations that cast doubt on the in-laws' claims of generosity, integrity, and propriety. Each word was a scalpel, slicing through layers of arrogance they had assumed were impenetrable. The pivotal moment arrived during the awards presentation, when the patriarch of the family prepared to give a speech boasting of their charitable deeds and social accomplishments. Just as he began, my brother intercepted with an innocuous question, referencing documented discrepancies that challenged the narrative. The room froze. A ripple of murmurs spread through the guests as evidence, photographs, financial inconsistencies, and first-hand accounts was subtly presented. The patriarch's smile faltered, the carefully practiced speech unraveling under the weight of undeniable truth. My daughter's eyes widened with astonishment, realizing that the invisible forces she hadn't understood were now actively defending her. I could see the in-laws' carefully cultivated confidence cracking, their status and power teetering under the gaze of witnesses who now questioned their credibility. They attempted to salvage appearances, to joke, to redirect attention, but every attempt was met with polite but pointed reminders of the facts. The humiliation was not loud or theatrical. It was a quiet, precise erosion of authority, leaving them exposed, vulnerable, and visibly shaken. Guests whispered, exchanged glances, and the smug superiority that had dominated every encounter since the lake incident evaporated in real time. In the aftermath, the balance of power had shifted unmistakably. My daughter, previously timid and fearful, now stood taller, her presence a testament to the quiet justice that had been orchestrated. The in-laws, stripped of the aura of invincibility they had wielded for so long, were left to navigate the aftermath of their arrogance. I felt a surge of vindication, tempered by the awareness that the public exposure was not cruel, but corrective, a reflection of the truths they had long ignored or dismissed. That night, as the gala ended and guests departed, I watched my daughter relax, the tension finally draining from her small frame. My brother and I exchanged a brief knowing glance. Mission accomplished, yet the lessons remained. Justice had been delivered with precision, revealing the in-laws for who they truly were, and restoring dignity to those who had been marginalized. The reckoning was complete, and the echoes of this confrontation would linger far longer than the event itself. A permanent reminder that arrogance and cruelty, no matter how polished, cannot withstand truth and patience. The days after the gala were surreal, like stepping into a world where the rules had finally shifted. My daughter walked taller, her shyness replaced with a cautious pride that I hadn't seen before. She had been vindicated, not through anger or spectacle, but through truth and careful timing. The in-laws' smiles no longer held the same confidence. Their every word and gesture now carried the weight of public scrutiny. Guests who had once nodded politely now whispered reminders of the discrepancies, the contradictions, the arrogance they had so casually displayed. Even casual interactions carried consequences. Invitations we had once been denied were extended with a tentative, awkward politeness, and the in-laws hesitated in asserting authority over events and gatherings they had always controlled. Friends and acquaintances who had previously deferred to their status began to question decisions, remarking discreetly on the cracks in their polished image. It was a subtle social dismantling, a ripple effect of embarrassment and recognition that their power was no longer absolute. Financial consequences also began to emerge. A few carefully documented inconsistencies we had shared with select associates caused previously unquestioned donations and investments to be reconsidered. They found themselves negotiating cautiously, their past arrogance replaced by a tentative approach that spoke louder than any confrontation could. Every carefully orchestrated smile now masked a subtle anxiety, a recognition that their influence could no longer be wielded without scrutiny. Most importantly, my daughter felt the impact in a personal, tangible way. The weight of humiliation, fear, and exclusion lifted incrementally as she realized that the people who had tormented her no longer controlled the narrative. She could speak freely, laugh without hesitation, and reclaim the confidence that had been eroded over years of subtle neglect and cruelty. Each moment of her emerging self-assurance was a reminder that justice need not be violent or loud to be absolute. It only needed precision, patience, and persistence. As I watched her navigate these days, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not from revenge itself, but from the restoration of balance. The in-laws faced the consequences of their arrogance and cruelty, and my daughter experienced the empowerment she deserved. The audience witnessing this journey, the imagined viewers of our story, would feel the relief, the vindication, and the moral satisfaction that comes from seeing justice delivered with elegance, subtlety, and undeniable impact. The house was quiet that evening, the chaos of confrontation and exposure finally fading into stillness. I sat in the living room, my daughter curled beside me, her small hand tucked into mine, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. The lake, the shoves, the whispers and smirks of the in-laws, all of it lingered in memory, but the sharp edges had dulled. Justice had been served, yet the journey left a bittersweet taste. Triumph intertwined with the weight of years of neglect and cruelty we could never fully erase. I reflected on the lessons this ordeal had carved into my heart. Patience, observation, and quiet strength mattered more than loud confrontation. I realized that resilience isn't just enduring hardship. It's understanding when to act, how to wield influence, and when to let others see the consequences of their choices. I thought about my daughter, and the clarity it gave me to witness her reclaim confidence, dignity, and trust. The victories weren't flashy, but they were real, and they were lasting. Family bonds had been tested in the harshest ways, and yet, even amidst betrayal and malice, there remained threads of connection worth protecting. My daughter's laughter returned slowly, tentative at first, then more assured, a reminder that love and loyalty could survive cruelty if nurtured carefully. I understood that moral closure doesn't erase pain. It reframes it, transforming helplessness into empowerment, anger into deliberate action, and despair into lessons learned. There was also humility in the reflection. I acknowledged my own limitations, the times I had stayed silent or failed to act, and the necessity of combining caution with courage. Life had shown that justice is rarely immediate or obvious, but patience and strategy could tip even the most entrenched power structures. The in-laws, humiliated and diminished in status, would carry their consequences quietly, while my daughter and I moved forward, stronger, wiser, and more aligned with our sense of right. As night deepened, I watched my daughter drift to sleep, a soft smile on her face. The world felt momentarily balanced, the scales tipped toward truth and integrity. Bittersweet as it was, the lessons were clear. Cruelty can be undone, patience can wield power, and love, when paired with strategy, protects the vulnerable while restoring justice. I closed my eyes, allowing the relief to settle, knowing that while scars remain, so too does the satisfaction of a reckoning that was both deserved and necessary. As the sun rose over the days that followed, I found myself sitting quietly, replaying the events that had reshaped our lives. The lake, the shoves, the laughter, and the smug faces of the in-laws. They all lingered like echoes of a storm, reminders of the cruelty and injustice that had once seemed insurmountable. And yet, amidst those echoes, I felt the steady pulse of resilience and strength that had carried us through. My daughter, once small and fearful, now moved with a quiet confidence that spoke louder than any confrontation could. Watching her reclaim her dignity reminded me that empowerment is not instantaneous. It is earned through patience, strategy, and unwavering belief in one's worth. I thought of the in-laws, their arrogance dismantled piece by piece, their carefully constructed facades exposed for all to see. Justice had been delivered not through loud spectacle, but through deliberate, thoughtful action, proving that power and status can never shield cruelty from consequences. The subtle victories, the moments of observation, and the careful interventions had all accumulated into a reckoning that was as precise as it was satisfying. For my daughter, for me, and for anyone who has ever felt dismissed or underestimated, it was a testament to the quiet potency of resolve. In reflecting on this journey, I understood that true strength lies in restraint and clarity of purpose. Anger alone accomplishes little, but measured action, grounded in empathy and intelligence, can shift the scales in ways that feel almost poetic. The lessons were clear. Patience amplifies strategy, subtlety can wield power, and the bonds that matter most, those rooted in love, loyalty, and shared understanding, can withstand even the harshest storms. I felt a profound sense of closure, tempered with the recognition that scars remain, but they serve as reminders of endurance and growth. Looking at my daughter, her eyes bright with the spark of regained confidence, I knew the story wasn't just about revenge, it was about transformation. It was about reclaiming dignity, asserting worth, and turning injustice into a catalyst for empowerment. The echoes of the past no longer held us hostage. They became the foundation for a stronger, wiser future. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I realized that the power to confront cruelty, protect the vulnerable, and restore balance exists not in rage, but in measured, deliberate action guided by heart and mind alike. We had endured, we had acted, and we had prevailed, not with spectacle, but with purpose. And that truth, as much as any triumph or lesson, would linger long after the echoes faded, leaving a sense of empowerment, reflection, and hope that no cruelty, no matter how calculated, could ever fully erase.